If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. This episode is going to be about optimism and pessimism, and I'm going to tie that to productivity because the whole mindset thing is a productivity concern for me. So we talk a lot about confidence on the podcast here, and that's because I think confidence ties to productivity. And I think the tie there is ideas around, say, imposter syndrome, uh, quality concerns, all these different kinds of ideas. So I think we struggle a little bit to understand what confidence is and how it relates to optimism. So we're going to pile all that in and talk about it today. We're going to talk about optimism, pessimism, confidence, imposter syndrome, all these different mindsets, and really try and get those mindsets straight so that they don't have a negative impact on our productivity. And if at all possible, that they have a positive impact on productivity. Now, I've recorded before about how important I think confidence is. I think confidence is absolutely fundamental to the kinds of things that we're trying to do. And I think it's perhaps even more important for knowledge workers than it is for other kinds of workers. And we'll get into that. By the same token, I think the close cousin of confidence, that is optimism, is fundamental to productivity. Now, a lot of this perhaps also has to do with more long-term career growth, in addition to short-term notions of productivity. The career growth thing for now, I want to leave that aside and just talk about the impact on nearer term productivity. I'll say there's a problem in that a lot of people are pessimists. And if you're a pessimist and you're not optimistic, you're not confident in your ability to do something, or you're a pessimist and you think that the world is conspiring against your ability to do something, then you've got to be very careful because it could be that your actual ability to do that thing is going to be pretty limited. Now, I think it's important to us as knowledge workers, particularly because of a lot of the time it's this invisible work that we do. And because of that, we, as knowledge workers particularly, are prone to these negative mental gymnastics that I alluded to in the opening, like writer's block, imposter syndrome, this pessimism about can we actually do our work, and this seemingly intense focus on our mental state in order to get our work done. And I think that's really the tie. We recognize that we're working with our brains, and then we say, okay, brain, how you feeling? And our brain goes, meh. And so we then get worried about whether or not we can produce what we need to produce. But I do think our feelings about a thing that we're going to need to do have a lot to do with our tendency to procrastinate, our ability to marshal, if you will, all of our mental forces on the target and keep them there. And so I think when we have the opportunity, we should cultivate optimism as a mindset and confidence as a mindset. And that's why I like to talk about this stuff. So over the rest of the podcast, I'll give you some tools and some motivation to embrace this optimism. If you're not an optimist, and try to help you work towards being an optimist, okay? embrace your optimism. If you have it, embrace it and use it, and don't worry about it. And we'll talk about this a little bit. Now, I am aware of a recently prevalent notion, and the notion is toxic positivity. And what most people say when they mean this is there's potentially in some parts of our lives pressure to maintain an upbeat and positive attitude, even in the face of difficult circumstances. And our modern culture says this can invalidate genuine emotions and prevent healthy emotional processing. Okay. At the same time, though, I don't know if that is worth fighting over, worth being afraid of. I'm certainly not talking about, calling it a flesh wound when your arm gets cut off. Okay. A little Monty Python homage to you out there. And I think that this is a little bit challenging. I do think that in our world, and I don't have time to go into the detail why I think this way, but in our world, we tend to really be hyper analytical of mental states. And anything can be toxic, right? Toxic positivity. I mean, it's almost an oxymoron to even say it. Now, I do think there's some pressure, but I think some of that pressure to look on the bright side, some of that pressure to be an optimist is good because it reminds us that that's the better state for us. Now, if somebody you need to grieve or you need to mourn or there's a tragedy in your life and somebody wanders through and goes, well, you're a jerk face because you can't put a positive spin on this. I mean, that's just a person that's being rude and mean to you. And you might want to consider other associates, and I'm making light of it. Other associates are friends. So I'm going to say, let's be optimistic. But there are times when your feelings are hurt. And there's a difference between a general life outlook and an immediate set of feelings. There's a difference between a habit of mind, a habitual mindset, and episodes of a different mindset. And that doesn't make those episodes bad. It just makes them what they are. So feel what you feel. Don't necessarily let it become a habit unnecessarily. And don't let it overly color your ideas about your future and your own agency. And I think you'll understand my perspective a little bit more as we get on through this a little bit. So, realistic positivity, optimism. I will say that in my experience, most people who get things done are relatively optimistic. They would definitely fall on the positive side of the optimism spectrum. That's my sample size. I may be looking at it through my own filters. It's certainly not a scientific sample. But I think many people will tell you the same thing. Many people in my position that study this sort of thing will say that there's this can-do-ness of things. I was given a quote from Zig Ziglar, so it was verbal, so I'm not sure I've got it exactly right. But Zig said, you can't do anything with positive thinking, but you can do everything better. So there's no one thing you can do with positive thinking that you can't do without positive thinking, but everything just kind of moves along a little bit better when you've got this positive, optimistic mindset. So you can't positive think yourself. You can't imagine yourself into $1 million. but you can positive think and bolster your courage into doing the things and doing them quickly and doing them well, these things that will lead to your $1 million. And certainly just because positivity and optimism don't get you your million, that doesn't automatically mean that pessimism and negativity will get you your million. And so, just continuing to think about that. Now, on this podcast quite often, and when we talk about mindset and all these different things, the notion of discipline comes up pretty frequently. And I recently ran across a good definition of discipline, and I want you to make you aware of it. And that definition is, so discipline is doing something that you can do that enables you to do something that you cannot do by direct effort. I'll say that again. Discipline is taking actions that you can directly take. Those actions enable you to accomplish something that you can't do by direct effort. As I said, so many of the things that we talk about here on the podcast are actually disciplines according to that definition. So we do some of the things that we need to do to make us more productive, and that allows us to do the things that we want to do, accomplish the larger tasks that we want to accomplish. In the list of positive things, we'll add a growth mindset as one of the positives. And creating a growth mindset, which we can do in our acts of will and in our habits of thought, will give us a path to accomplish other things that we can't currently do. If you don't cultivate a growth mindset, then it's very difficult to motivate yourself to get better about things. In actuality, if you don't have a growth mindset, you may literally believe that your skill set is fixed. And you can imagine how stuck that would get somebody who's trying to learn and trying to grow and trying to get better at what it is they do. We tend, in my mind, to misunderstand the power of our mentality, the power of our minds. And I fear that the science is not strong here because it easily bridges over into this notion of spirit and soul, which is maybe still psychology, but really begins to border on philosophy. And science gets a little iffy in that frame in terms of what science feels comfortable saying and not comfortable saying. And I tell you that to say that this mental thing that happens that we do is something that we really need to be on top of and stay on top of. But I do think that negativity in our minds and a negative stance towards tasks really pushes our tendency to procrastinate, to not put in a solid effort, to do it just to get done with it, these kinds of things. Now, how much of that is true, I don't know, and I can't find the science on it. But it is quite obvious based on anecdotal information that I have and on analysis of my own life that if we're about to go into an activity and while we're going into that activity, we're constantly telling ourselves, oh, I hate this activity. I hate doing expense reports. Then what our brain is going to do is going to give us a negative experience with that activity. Your brain is a prediction machine. And what your brain literally does is it predicts a state of the world and then visually shows you what's different from that expected state. And that prediction and that mentality happens as well as we're doing things. So if you predict you're going to have this negative situation, then your brain's going to go, yeah, it was negative. Where if you predict you're going to have this positive situation, then your brain is more likely to return positive to you. And again, I don't know of a lot of science there, but we're talking about this optimism, this realistic positivity, if you will. And I don't like the term realistic, and I'll get into it a little bit later about why that's something that I am not real fond of. But this optimism, this positive outlook, this can-do attitude, it probably won't be as challenging as I think it will be. These kinds of ideas, I think, are useful to us in many, many cases. Now, as we're going through and we're thinking about these things, we really need to understand what science is available. And there's some. It's a little indirect in my mind, but there is some. And when we think about, so we were talking about this can-do kind of attitude. We'll throw around terms like grit, tenacity. We'll throw around these terms as well in terms of positive mental attributes, optimistic, confident mental states. And then we'll talk about, for example, we'll talk about learned helplessness as a negative mental state. And if you don't know what learned helplessness is, this is very interesting. A scientist named Martin Seligman in the 70s, I think, did some experiments to demonstrate what learned helplessness is. And the experiments that he did were with animals, and he put the animals in a position where they were getting mild electric shocks, but somewhat painful. Okay. And they couldn't get away from it. There was nothing they could do about it. They were constrained in such a way that they couldn't get away. And after some period of time in this environment, he then moved these animals to an environment where they could get away, but they didn't. And they had learned or gotten the mentality that there was nothing they could do about this. And so they didn't even try. So that's this learned helplessness. And do we as humans have this learned helplessness? I hate to give an authoritative answer either way, but if we do, then we need to fight it. And I think that if you really look, then this learned helplessness is the flip side of tenacity. And tenacity is real important. And we'll get into specifically why. It has to do with problem solving, but tenacity is really important, and grit and these kinds of ideas are really important as we have a confident, positive, optimistic outlook. So that's this notion of learned helplessness. Well, big deal, Larry. What's the problem? There was also an experiment that I learned about recently that had to do with, I'm told it was rats. I don't know. But some animals were put in water in a bucket or a container with steep sides that they couldn't get out of the water, and it was too deep. They couldn't stand there, so they were swimming. And what happened is they were timed to see how long they would go before they just kind of gave up swimming. And that was measured. And then what the experimental treatment was about tenacity. And they did this and took some of these rats, so they let them swim for a long time, just short of the number at which the previous set gave up. And then they took them out of the water. Okay. So you can see that the experimenters were trying to teach their rats that the continued effort would produce a result. So this then is the opposite, if you will, of this learned helplessness notion. They took the rats out of the water. And then after a while, those rats that they had taken out of the water, they put back in the water and let them do it again. And apparently, this again was reported to me verbally. Apparently, there was a huge difference in the amount of time the rats would swim after they had been rescued and had this positive outlook that swimming would help them stay alive. And this is really interesting because it was a huge difference. It wasn't double. It was 10 times and more. So the rats that had been rescued and again, I'm going to use words, believed that the swimming would produce a result, really swam a lot longer. And if you think about that and you're in this position, if you swim for an hour and give up, well, there's X chance that a boat will come by and rescue you. Where if you swim for 10 hours before you give up, then there's a whole different chance that a boat will come rescue you. And that's this tenacity and this perseverance. So we look at this notion of grit as well. And Angela Duckworth was the one to talk about grit, and it made a splash 12 or 15 years ago. And grit is this kind of perseverance, maybe, thinking like the rats in the bucket. And this is I didn't get the result. The grit is I didn't get the result I wanted. It's this tenacity idea, but I'm going to keep giving it a shot here. And so we are looking at all these different things. So that bit of science, I think, helps us understand this connection. And thinking about this positivity thing and confidence. And, this is going to produce a result. So when we get through the science, there's really this science about these positive things, this grit, tenacity, optimism, and confidence pile versus the pile of learned helplessness, apathy, fixed mindset versus growth mindset that are these kind of negative mental states. And that's really kind of what we're going to fight against here. Now, most people that I talk to in the American culture, if you accuse them of being pessimists, they're going to have something to say about that. And they're going to say, no, I'm not a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist about what I can do. I'm a pessimist about the trajectory of the overall world. In other words, I have lots of confidence. I just think that the world is going south in a handbasket. Now, that's a really interesting perspective because if you look at the trend, and this is counter to what we observe in culture and maybe even in the news. Human well-being, human flourishing has steadily improved for as long as there have been histories to record it. Steven Pinker wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he analyzed this question and the facts behind it. And his kind of leading question, if you will, was, hey, a lot of people get nostalgic and they think, oh, what would be the best time to be born, right? Oh, I would like to see X, Y, and Z period in history. So maybe it would have been better to be born there. And he says it's absolutely clear. There is no better time to be born than today. And his point is a practical one of human flourishing. So our technology has steadily gotten better. Our medicine and healthcare have steadily gotten better. Our mortality rate in birth has steadily declined, both for the mother and the baby. All of these, all of these measures have improved, even if improving is decreasing over time. And it's not just the technological era of the last 100 years. I mean, you go back and back and back and back, and all the evidence that we have shows that we're getting better. Our governmental systems are getting better. As cultures, as human beings, we're becoming kinder human beings over this large sweep of time. And so if you doubt that, you might want to take a look at Steven Pinker and the Better Angels of Our Nature. And the pithy point that gets made in this discussion is 200 years ago, it did not matter how much money you had. You could not buy a refrigerator and you could not get penicillin. And it didn't matter that you were rich. It didn't matter where you lived. Now, everybody has a refrigerator and penicillin. Maybe not everybody, but you know what I mean. It doesn't take a whole ton of money to get these things. And there's a parallel here that I'll get into real quickly when we talk about the movement of human flourishing. People, economists and investment people will tell you that there has never been a 10-year period where the stock market did not make money. So there's never been a 10-year period where if you put money in on year 1 and measured on year 10, you had more money on year 10. Now, there have been plenty of people who put money in on year 1 and took it out on year 7 and lost their shirts. But the point is, it's a long-term investment and you need to stay in there for the long term. And I would suggest that a similar notion is true for human flourishing on the scale of a human lifespan. I would say there's probably never been a 75 or 100-year period in which, from beginning to end, things didn't improve for humans and our sense of flourishing and being successful humans. So, long-term optimism appears to be the way to roll. And that's fighting against this notion of, well, you know, I'm not really a pessimist about myself. I'm a pessimist about the world. And there's no factual reason to be a pessimist about the world. There have been only these brief periods of time where things have gotten worse. The Depression, for example, was a brief period of time where things got worse, and they got significantly worse, and they stayed significantly worse for a little while, and then they got better. Urban murder rates spiked in apparently about the 70s, and violent crimes went up pretty significantly, but then they came back down and returned to the overall trend, which is this decrease of violence in society. So, from a societal perspective, optimism appears to be the way to roll. If the future is anything like the past, which is the only way we can predict the future, then optimism about our cultural growth seems to be the way to go. And then, of course, personally, optimism is clearly the way to roll. That's one enemy. And I think there's another enemy that maybe is more insidious. And this has to do with personal pessimism. And there's this notion in the world that optimism is naive and unsophisticated. Further, that educated people are rationalists as compared to optimists. I think optimism gets caricatured. I think that's a fairly new thing. I think in history, optimism was more generally applauded, perhaps, but I don't know for sure. Now, certainly pessimism has always gotten caricatured and complained about by people. And it's, don't be a pessimist, it's not good for you, be an optimist, all these sorts of things. And so in the modern world, what happens is when I see people who are not optimists, they'll not admit to being pessimists. They'll just say they're being rationalists. And I find that to be an interesting perspective to take, because if we think about, okay, well, I'm just a rationalist. Well, a rationalist is a person who takes the evidence into account and puts great weight on the evidence, and who brings history into account and brings science into account and puts great weight on that. So in order to be a rationalist, you have to assume that you know what's going to happen in the future, and that those projections are correct. A rationalist look at the past and what did we actually see, and let's not make up stories about what we saw, is very much a great idea. And then we say, and I'm using air quotes, we say we're rationalists about the future to disguise some pessimism, in my mind, when in fact, if we actually look at the trends, as I said before, we have every reason to be optimistic about the cultural improvement, and certainly about our own ability to do and to make things happen. Now, and the following thing may just be because I have young 20-year-old children who are just now leaving the house. And so my sample size may be skewed. But there's this notion that I don't want to be optimistic because I'm trying to limit my downside disappointment. So as near as I understand, the way this works is I don't want to expect good things because that will increase my disappointment if good things don't happen. And that is, if you think about it, that is a pretty tortured set of logic. Because first of all, it assumes that my frustration is in proportion to the degree that my reality does not match up with my expectations. My disappointment increases with a broader distance between what I had expected or hoped for and what actually turned out to be the case. And I'm not aware of any science on this front, but I really haven't seen much. And to continue to explain what I think is happening, just so we've got it perfectly clear in our minds. The claim is at some point of time A, we're going to have an expectation of an outcome that will occur at time B. And after time B, we're going to look back at what happened at time B and be either happy or mad. And that happy or mad is going to have somehow to do with whether our result was less than our expectation or greater than our expectation. Thus, the logic is if I expect the absolute best, then the only thing that could happen is less than that. And thus, I'm going to get frustration out of it. Therefore, in order to avoid frustration, I'm going to temper my expectations. And I don't know that that makes a whole ton of sense. I don't know that we can fine tune it quite that well. I don't know that that makes a whole lot of sense, and there's certainly not a whole lot of science to back it up. So if you expect a cookie to taste great, to be the best cookie you've ever had, and you eat it and it's an average cookie, are you then more disappointed than if you set the expectation falsely for the cookie to be an average cookie? And about the only psychology I could find to apply to this question is this notion that human beings are satisficers. And you may be familiar with the term, but I'll explain it briefly. When we are satisficing, what we're doing is we're taking into account the level of effort in order to find the best solution. So the way this works is if I want to go have some ice cream and there's not any in the house, I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to buy some ice cream. Now, I may have a flavor of ice cream in my mind is, ooh, that would be exactly what I want. And so I go to the store and they don't have it. Most likely what I will do is I will pick another flavor of ice cream that I like consistent with the effort of going from store to store to store, trying to find the one that I wanted, if that makes sense. So we humans are perfectly happy to accept a result that's not the ideal result because we balance that against the additional effort of achieving the desired result. So the logic is, well, I really wanted mint chocolate chip. They don't have mint chocolate chip, so it looks like the closest thing that they have is regular chocolate chip. So I could go all over town looking for mint chocolate chip. I don't have the time or the inclination to do that. So regular chocolate chip will be the ice cream I'll choose, and I'll be perfectly happy with it. And so that's this notion of satisficing. And we do it all the time because we factor that in. So that's a thing about this whole, I'm going to temper my expectations so I'm not greatly disappointed. Secondly, if you hold the logic that you should temper your expectations so that you won't be greatly disappointed, then eventually you've got to, as you're following the logic and minimizing your negative disappointment, so to speak, then you've got to eventually expect that every cookie you're ever going to eat is going to be the worst cookie you've ever had. And if you're expecting the worst cookie that you've ever had, are you actually even going to eat the cookie? And so that expectation, that degradation, if you will, of expectation has no end or limit. And that to me seems like a really bad choice of a logical approach to solving a situation. Now, that's presuming that we can actually manage our base expectation. Assuming that it's possible for us to say, oh, well, right, I didn't want that. I'm not expecting a great outcome, so I won't be disappointed. I'm not sure that we can change our expectation. And then probably the biggest negative here is that this whole thing, to me, resembles the notion of learned helplessness, in that we teach ourselves that there's never going to be a time when we can expect to be delighted and become delighted. So, and the whole thing's a little bit of a slippery slope anyway. So I tried to, that's why I'm really digging down and getting the detail and trying to turn it into a very, very clear set of thoughts about what we're doing so that we can think about it more clearly. But I really am concerned about this. the other side is I'm also wondering whether that's a stage of growth in the human psyche where we go through this and then we finally decide, well, I'd rather, sometimes expect the pony for Christmas and be disappointed than constantly not have any high level of expectation. And oh, by the way, if your expectations are constantly in the dumps, then why open the Christmas package at all? So I think that's a little bit of a challenge there. Now, I will say when we look at optimism versus pessimism, there is some notion of this idea of strategic optimism versus strategic pessimism. I did see some research on that, and that was defined in really interesting ways. So strategic optimism is assuming that you're going to get a good outcome so that you'll put in a solid effort to motivate yourself to put in a solid effort. And this is the opposite of this kind of argument that we've been having over the last minute or two, right? We do believe as humans that thinking that we'll get a good outcome for a high level of effort will actually help us produce that high level of effort. This is strategic optimism. And then the researchers in this area talked about strategic pessimism. And they define strategic pessimism as considering the negative outcomes so that alternative plans could be made or steps could be taken to avoid them. And to call that strategic pessimism to me is a strange use of the terminology. To me, that's just planning, right? I mean, if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to run some risk of harming myself. So I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z as I try to accomplish this task. That's just good common sense planning. I don't know that that's pessimism per se, but that's how they defined it. And that was the only science that I kind of saw in this area. And then finally, I will say there's this idea of an engineering mindset. If you've heard me talk very much, I consider myself some sort of an engineer or some sort of a tinkerer, and I enjoy doing that. But we get into this mindset, and I've talked with people about this, and my view is that the engineering mindset is, I'm going to say, short-term pessimism, short-term fault finding, if you will, and long-term optimism. And what I mean by that is that as engineers, we have to look for problems, but we look for them because we're confident that we can solve them and make the situation better. And I would suggest that, with that idea in mind, and on the podcast here, we talk about a definition of work as turning ourselves and our environment into what we want it to be, or moving it in the direction of what we want it to be. Those kinds of ideas are how we define work. So work is how we go about doing that. And the very notion there is based on some form of optimism. I'm going to put some work in, and the world is going to be a better place, or at least my world is going to be a better place. And that seems to me to correspond. And so fostering this optimism and not falling prey to the arguments that we talked about a minute ago, not falling prey to the notion of, I better keep my expectations low so I won't be disappointed, and not falling prey to the idea that optimism is this naive approach and pessimism is somehow more sophisticated and cooler than optimism, and trying to avoid those kinds of ideas. And then we can have this grit, this tenacity, this optimism about outcomes. And, I think it's really important that we do that, particularly in the kind of work that we do, because we often lack clear milestones of progress and clear markers of what our percent done is. And so it can be frustrating. If we look at the engineering mindset and we look at problem solving, we get there. Now, the definition of discipline that I used earlier, I think that's interesting here because that pretty much has to be founded in some sense of optimism. I want result B. I can't get that by direct effort. I know that I can get thing A by direct effort. And my hypothesis is that having thing A delivers thing B as a matter of human existence. Let me see if I can be a little more clear. You cannot get in shape by sheer mental effort. What you can do by sheer mental effort is go work out. And then working out produces us to get in better shape. And so that's what I mean by that optimism. And then tenacity and grit. This kind of goes back to the rats in the bucket story that we talked about a minute ago. But the parallel to that is, you take two big old frogs and you drop them in two buckets of cream. And one swims for a while and says, well, this is no good. I'm going to give up. And the other keeps kicking and kicking and kicking and finally turns the cream into butter. And then he stands on it and is able to jump out. And so I think that's a real interesting picture of the rats in the bucket, because we don't know how things are going to turn out. So, we get back into this, thinking about this engineering mindset and this work mindset that we have. And when we look at problem solving, which is what we're doing in engineering, we're problem solving. The progression of problem solving is not linear. It happens in fits and starts and bursts of insight, and therefore it requires tenacity. And I think that tenacity is best founded in an optimistic outlook as compared to an outlook of, quote, realism. So I hope that you've gotten the idea that optimism is a good approach, that this positive mindset is the way to go. Certainly, we do control that. If we want to have a positive outlook, we can, by habit of thought, do that. And so I hope I've motivated you and talked about some alternatives that I think are less good for our productivity. So we'll do a quick recap. We talked about positivity, optimism, all these great kinds of things, tenacity, grit. We talked about the alternatives, which are mindsets of, negativity, learned helplessness, pessimism, a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, these kinds of ideas. And we looked at some arguments for why one should not be an optimist. We talked about being a realist and why people thought that was important. We found some psychology and some science supporting this notion of tenacity and grit, and it's a doable thing. We talked about pessimism in terms of its target, the whole, well, I'm not pessimistic about me, but I am pessimistic about the rest of the world and how that works. And so we've, I think, finally defended against these arguments, and we've come to the realization that if we're going to be workers in the sense that we define work here on the podcast, then that involves this engineering mindset and this projection that the world can be a better place and I can make it a better place through my own work and my own efforts. And I think that's really where productivity comes from, is that tenacity, that problem solving mindset, that willingness to engage and have some grit about staying engaged with things, even though our results might not have this huge positive psychological reward. And I think it's really important for us as knowledge workers simply because of the fact that we don't have those same mile markers as people who do more observable, maybe more physical work do. So I would encourage you to be an optimist and to think about these arguments that we've had here if you find yourself not being an optimist, and that will help us. At a minimum, it'll help us avoid procrastinating against some of our tasks. And it'll teach us that we can, in fact, have a happy mindset about things, even though we may not feel that way to begin with. We can learn optimism, if you will. As always, this is a sample of some coaching that we might do if we were working together. And this talk has come from discussions that I've had with some clients when they were in periods of pessimism and tried to help them understand. And so now you're seeing me a little bit as a productivity mindset coach. And I enjoy helping people with these kinds of ideas. It's part of what goes on beneath the practical training in Attention Compass. So I want you to take this on board and think about it as you're figuring out how to do busy right, because I think that this notion of positivity really is going to help us as we move along through this. If you'd like to discuss this at greater length, feel free to reach out. You can get me on LinkedIn, or you can hit me at larry@dobusyright.com. That's my direct email. If you get in touch, please mention the podcast and that you're listening to that. And then we can begin to have a two-way conversation here and maybe do some question and answer kind of thing. So I'm pulling for you. I hope that this helps you get out there and do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.